Following the collapse of Yugoslavia, the Balkans erupted in violent conflict, often accompanied with ethnic cleansing and genocide. At Srebrenica, thousands of Bosnian men and boys were massacred by Bosnian Serbs in a bid to create a greater Serbia. In today's video, we will be looking just how such a complex and violent war could take place, just what happened to so many, and the consequences for those responsible. It is perhaps helpful to start with a description of the dissolution of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1992. Yugoslavia was incredibly diverse, with 2 alphabets, 5 main religions, and 6 federal states that formed a whole. The country was formed with the notion that all ethnic groups within the border were equal, as all played a part in expelling the Axis forces during the Second World War. 6 large autonomous republics were formed, with 2 autonomous regions. The country was led by Josip Tito, who was the major source of stability. During the 60s and 70s, efforts were made to decentralize power from the communist central government to the 6 republics. Those 6 republics were drawn up along rough ethnic and religious divides. Though, as time would go on, many people would move and settle all over Yugoslavia. Notably, each republic was given control of its own armed forces. On Tito's death, with no single individual nor any institution was capable of taking the reins, resulting in a joint presidency being established. 8 representatives from the republic and autonomous zones were to rule by simple majority between themselves. Each of the republics sought their own goals, such as Serbia pushing for more power, Bosnia and Herzegovina looking for independence, and Croatia seeking economic freedoms and not to have to support the poorer regions. As the Cold War ended, vital funds from both the West and the East dried up. As inflation took hold, the country plunged into a recession. A number of politicians, notably Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, sought to call for a greater Serbia, bringing in regions that had large populations of ethnic Serbs and stoking ethnic divisions during the economic troubles. Xenophobia against non-Serbs was rampant, particularly against Albanians, the largest non-recognized ethnic group in Yugoslavia. What's more, it was not enough that territory was brought into the Greater Serbia, but also that non-Serbs be expelled. Serbia sought to control Macedonia with a puppet government. As the 2 autonomous regions of Kosovo and Vojvodina were within Serbian borders, Serbian interests were pushed through the joint presidency. Other republics sought to split from Yugoslavia, with Croatia, Macedonia and Slovenia setting independence referendums in 1991, which were accepted. When the Croatian and Slovene referendums were passed in 1991, the Serbia Armed Forces launched attacks on the both newly formed countries, whilst Serbian paramilitary groups worked alongside the Serbian army. Whilst the conflict in Slovenia would last only 10 days, the war in Croatia would last until 1995. Against the backdrop of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina sought to seek independence. The multi-ethnic Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina was made up of 3 main ethnic groups. These were Muslim Bosniaks, who made up 44% of the population, Orthodox Christian Serbs 31%, and Catholic Croats 17%. On the 15th of October 1991, the Republic declared independence, with a referendum for independence following on the 29th of February 1992. A number of Bosnian Serbs boycotted the referendum, with the results favouring independence. Ethnic Serbian politicians had previously split from the coalition government and sought to create their own enclave, creating what would be known as the Republic of Srpska, headed by Radovan Karadzic. Whilst the Croatian Democratic Union Party attempted to create a similar region known as the Croatian Republic of Herzegovina. As these states within states were not approved by the Bosnian government, there was a risk of further conflict over perceived threats to the ethnic groups within them. Despite the growing conflict, Bosnia and Herzegovina was recognized internationally as a sovereign state. whilst Croatia and Serbia colluded to split the new country, with the goals of creating Greater Croatia and Serbia. In the months after Bosnia and Herzegovina's declaration of independence, Bosnian Serb paramilitary groups sprung to action, whilst the Serbian government set in its de facto army, the Yugoslav People's Army. This army would be rebranded as the Army of Republika Srpska. This force would have great success in taking over great swathes of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But whenever the army advanced, Bosnian Serbs would engage in ethnic cleansing of Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats in the newly conquered areas. The most infamous of these ethnic cleansings was the Srebrenica massacre in July of 1995. By 1995, the war in the Balkans had been raging for 4 years. The major powers of Britain, France, and the United States all pushed for the conflict to end. Yet, few were in favour of any meaningful military engagements. Thousands of refugees had fled ethnic cleansings, many reaching what were termed the 3 safety enclaves. These were Gorizde, Djepa, and Srebrenica. In 1993, the United Nations had already moved in, with hundreds of blue helmet peacekeepers to protect the refugees. The United Nations toughened its stance and demanded that peace in Bosnia would only be possible if there was a full withdrawal from all territories seized by the use of force and ethnic cleansing. But by 1995, the United Nations had seemingly given up on the 1993 declarations, with the powers of Britain, France, Germany and Russia instead favouring a partition of Bosnia between a Serb enclave state and a Muslim Croat federation. Pressure was placed on Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović to concede Srebrenica and other safe areas in exchange for peace, withdrawing the borders and conceding to Serbian demands. Izetbegović had been open to this idea, and when broaching the subject with the authorities in Srebrenica back in late 1993, he was flatly refused. In April of 1995, the Bosnian military commanders guarding Srebrenica were withdrawn, and were forbidden from returning. Instead, the protection of Srebrenica was for the United Nations. Whilst some pushed for reinforcements, others called for UN troops to withdraw in order for airstrikes to be an option. However, the Bosnian Serb tactic of holding UN troops prisoners often made such airstrikes infeasible, resulting in airstrikes being indefinitely called off by the French, British and American leaders in May of 1995. The Bosnian Serb plans for the area were not unknown to the world. The Colonel General of the Army of Republika Srpska, Ratko Mladić, had indicated to the head of the United Nations peacekeeping force, General Rupert Smith, that he had desires to take Srebrenica, and in speeches about the Muslim Bosniaks had indicated he wanted them to completely vanish. On the 2nd of June, Mladić ordered the destruction of the Muslim forces in their safety zones. Muslim forces was understood to mean all Muslim men and boys of fighting age. Whilst American and British intelligence had learned of this plan, such information was not shared with the Dutch UN peacekeeping force in the area. On the 6th of July, Mladić launched his attack on the safety zones. Some 2,000 Republika Srpska soldiers, outnumbered by the Bosniak defenders, made steady gains against the beleaguered resistance. In the following days, the 5 United Nations peacekeeping observation posts fell to the Bosnian Serb advance, with the Dutch peacekeepers retreating or being captured. As a result of the incursion, thousands of Bosniak civilians fled north into the towns of Srebrenica. Reports of looting, houses being burned to the ground, and the summary execution of refugees was widespread. On the 8th of July, leading United Nations generals and the only ones with authority to issue airstrikes were told to take holidays. On the 9th of July, President Karadzic ordered the taking of Srebrenica. The international community had not responded to the attack, and Bosniak resistance was not at all stopping the advance. On the 10th of July, United Nations Lieutenant Colonel Kermans had urgent request for air support from NATO forces. Yet, no such airstrikes ever took place. due to the hostages held by the Bosnian Serbs. On the 11th of July 1995, a column of Bosniak soldiers and male civilians made their way from Srebrenica with hopes of regrouping with the other Bosniak forces, and in a bid to escape execution. Meanwhile, around 25,000 Bosniak refugees from Srebrenica were gathered at the Potocari compound, seeking protection within the United Nations Forces headquarters. Thousands had managed to cram inside the building, with many more camping outside. The vast majority were women, children, and the elderly. By the afternoon of the 11th of July, the Republika Srpska forces, notably the Drina Corps and leadership, had control of Srebrenica and were strolling the streets. Amongst them was Mladic. The Dutch UN forces were ordered to allow the Republika Srpska forces to arrange the transport of Bosniak civilians, even going as far as to provide them 30,000 litres of petrol to Mladic's forces. From the Potocari compound, Bosnian Serb soldiers separated the men from the boys, and the women from the girls. During this sorting, SA was commonplace. In many cases, family members were made to watch their loved ones being assaulted. According to 14-year-old Fatima, "I was the first in the line. A soldier came over and yelled at me, 'You, come here.' I didn't even realize he was calling me. Then, he made my father come and stand in front of me. It wasn't until I saw the tears in my father's eyes that I understood what was about to happen. They were going to take me away, and they wanted him to see. They marched me into the woods with my hands up. I saw a lot of Serbian soldiers who were wearing thick masks made of socks. They didn't want their faces to be seen." Summary executions were carried out amongst the crowds, and much of these executions would be witnessed by the Dutch UN soldiers, and even when such events were recounted to UN observers, little could be or would be done to stop the murders. The women and girls were loaded onto buses to be sent further north to Muslim-controlled areas, though some reports include some buses being driven to Serb-controlled regions. The men who were taken from Potocari had all of their personal effects, such as IDs, confiscated and thrown into a pile. Once the last bus full of prisoners left, the effects were set on fire in full view of the United Nations soldiers, contradicting any assurances that the men and boys would be screened for those who had committed war crimes. The men and boys who were separated would never be seen again. There was a deliberate plan to capture all Bosniak men, whether or not they were of military age. Both young children and old men would meet the same fate as those of military age. Busloads of men and boys were sent to designated locations, whether that be at a local football pitch, abandoned warehouses, or fields. These would act as holding sites for the captives. Treatment at these sites was poor, with little in the way of food or water. Groups would be taken, stripped of their shoes and some of their clothing, had their hands tied behind their backs, and were transported to the kill sites. These groups of men and boys were lined up and machine-gunned. Survivors would then be searched for, and if found, would be shot again. Bulldozers were then used to pile the bodies into mass graves. This process would be repeated throughout the day. There were even reports of Serb soldiers asking their officers if they could sit down and take a break, exhausted from the constant massacring of civilians. One of the few to survive the killing fields, Mevludin Oric, recalled the following: "I just threw myself on the ground. My nephew shook and died on top of me. When they finished shooting, they went to get other groups. They kept bringing new rounds of men. I could hear crying and pleading, but they kept on shooting. It went on all day." The Serbian forces were eager to locate the column of soldiers and civilians attempting to escape the area, with officials claiming these were the very worst of the Bosniak criminal elements. The column would split into two following artillery strikes and would face the Republika Srpska forces on the 11th of July. Firefights broke out as the Bosniaks attempted to avoid capture and continue their escape. But as time progressed, hundreds were captured. Many were promised fair treatment or to be used in prisoner exchanges. Some Bosniaks were even convinced to shout for their comrades to surrender. In some instances, Serb soldiers using vehicles and uniforms taken from the UN headquarters pretended to be United Nations soldiers. Between the 12th and 22nd of July, only a few hundred Bosniak soldiers and civilians had managed to escape the area. Meanwhile, the Serb forces began the cleanup and cover-up of the massacres that had occurred. Buildings were burned to the ground and bodies were reburied. In all, over 8,300 people had been massacred in a bid to clear the region for Serbian occupation free of Muslims. It is hard to dispute that what took place at Srebrenica was indeed a genocide, from the murders to the forced deportations. After Srebrenica, other safe zones were targeted, notably Serbian forces taking Žepa and attempting to take Gorizde, though there was no repeat of the massacres. The men in Žepa had long since fled the area, whilst in Gorizde, Bosniak reinforcements helped avoid a slaughter. But at this point, the international community was no longer willing to concede ground to the Bosnian Serbs. Gorizde was the line drawn in the sand, with Operation Deliberate Force commencing 30th of August 1995. Airstrikes decimated the military might and threat of a greater Serbia, whilst some 60,000 United Nations peacekeepers were deployed to enforce the resulting Dayton peace agreements. The agreements were hastily agreed to by the Serbs in the face of a strong, if somewhat delayed, international response. Due to the scale of atrocities and war crimes committed by all parties to the Yugoslav war, a dedicated International Criminal Court was established. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia would examine crimes committed in the region since 1991. On the 24th of July 1995, Mladic was indicted for numerous crimes. Amongst them was his role in conducting the Srebrenica Genocide. He would, however, evade the authorities for some time, only being arrested in May of 2011. He was eventually convicted in 2017 for crimes including genocide and violations of the customs of war. As the military officer with overall command, Mladic was held personally responsible for the genocide at Srebrenica. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Whilst the Srebrenica genocide took place during an incredibly complex and messy conflict, there are still similarities that can be drawn with many of the genocides and massacres throughout history. Yet again, economic instability and the placement of blame on a group considered other. Historical tensions and bloodshed permeated the conflict, as thousands were displaced and massacred to achieve an ethnically cleansed Greater Serbia. Srebrenica is one part of the overall conflict, but remains in infamy due to the violence employed. Europe had not seen a genocide on its soil since the Holocaust, and yet the massacres in Bosnia were in many ways remnants of this time. The scars from the violence of the first half of the 20th century never truly healed, and during the Bosnian Wars, the blood flowed again. Links will be in the description for witness accounts of the horrors inflicted, and I would invite you all to take the time to listen to them.